Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're really getting into it, Bitcoin and property rights.
Yeah, this is a big one. There's a lot of buzz around this topic, and rightfully so.
It's one of those things you hear about it, you kind of get it, but then you realize, wait, I have a lot more questions.
Exactly. And the deeper you go, the more you realize how much it challenges our assumptions about ownership, value, the whole shebang.
And that's exactly what today's deep dive is all about. We've got some fascinating sources that really get into the weeds. And I got to say, some of these ideas are pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, one source even claimed that true private property might not have existed before Bitcoin.
Whoa. Okay, so like before we even get into Bitcoin, we have to rethink what it even means to own something.
It makes you think, right?
Yeah, like how much of what we consider ownership is really just based on trust in these systems that may or may not be all that trustworthy in the long run.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Who really controls a piece of land, for example?
Whoever's name is on the deed.
Sure, on paper, but ultimately it comes down to who has the power to defend it.
Okay, that's a bit more realistic, I guess.
For centuries, that power has rested with armies, with governments enforcing their own sets of rules and contracts.
So, like, what good is a contract if the people enforcing it suddenly decide to change their minds?
Precisely. And we see that time and time again throughout history, even today. Look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, both sides with claims to the same land going back generations.
Right, and it highlights how even claims to property that seem totally valid, totally legitimate, can be completely upended when the power dynamics shift.
Exactly. And that's where Bitcoin completely changes the game. It takes that reliance on external authorities out of the equation.
Because with Bitcoin, it's not about who has the bigger army or the more powerful government.
Exactly. It's about this decentralized network, this immutable code that no single entity can control or manipulate. So when you own Bitcoin, it's like having this unchangeable enforcer that guarantees your ownership.
But, I mean, let's be real. Someone could still, like, hold you at gunpoint for your Bitcoin password.
Yeah, that's true. One of our sources actually used that very example. As dark as it sounds, it makes you think.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
With traditional assets, your house, your car, your bank account, they can all be seized, confiscated, taken.
Right.
But Bitcoin, it gives you the choice. You still have the ability to truly own something that can't be forcibly taken.
So it's less about the thing itself, the Bitcoin, and more about the choice it represents.
Exactly. It's a powerful distinction. It's about having true control over your property for maybe the first time in history.
Wow. Okay, we went from land to Bitcoin as property pretty quickly. It's a lot to wrap my head around. But what does this actually look like in the real world? Where can we see this playing out?
Well, that's where our next source takes us, El Salvador.
Mhm.
You know, the world's first Bitcoin nation.
Right. I've been hearing so much about it. Like, it's one thing to talk about this stuff theoretically, but El Salvador is where it's actually happening, right?
Exactly. It's like a real-world experiment in what a Bitcoin-powered economy could look like.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What are we seeing in El Salvador that we're not seeing anywhere else?
Well, for starters, Bitcoin's impact goes way beyond just individual ownership. We're
Right, yeah.
talking about reshaping the entire economic landscape.
So, like, how does that work? What does that even look like in practice?
Think about it this way. Remember we were talking about how traditional property rights rely on these external authorities?
Yeah, the governments, the armies, all that.
Right. Well, Bitcoin offers an alternative. It allows for these things called circular economies.
Circular economies. Okay, now you're just using big words to sound smart. What does that even mean?
Fair enough. It's actually a pretty simple concept. Instead of your money constantly flowing out to these huge corporations or financial institutions, it stays within your local community.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
So, like, supporting your local businesses, keeping that money circulating locally.
Exactly. It's about creating a more sustainable, resilient system where everyone benefits. And the sources actually highlight a pretty interesting side effect of this shift: lower crime rates.
Wait, seriously. Bitcoin is fighting crime now. That's the one.
It's not that Bitcoin itself is fighting crime, but think about it. When your savings are no longer being eaten away by inflation, when you have this currency that's actually appreciating in value.
It's like you've got more skin in the game.
Right.
You're less likely to do something risky like steal when your money is actually working for you.
Precisely. And as more people adopt Bitcoin, as the economy becomes more stable, it creates a ripple effect. Businesses thrive, there are more opportunities, and suddenly crime just becomes a lot less appealing.
It's like that feeling when you finally pay off a credit card and you have all that extra money each month. Suddenly you're thinking about the long term, right? Like maybe I can finally start investing or saving for a down payment.
That's a great analogy because
Yeah.
that's what we're seeing in El Salvador. People are finally able to plan for the future, to invest in themselves and their communities. The sources had this amazing story about a man who built a rainwater reservoir under his house to avoid the city's high water bills.
Wow, that's commitment.
Right. But it just goes to show the kind of long-term thinking Bitcoin seems to inspire. He wasn't worried about making a quick buck. He was thinking about building a more sustainable future for himself and his family.
It's like this underlying sense of security, the
Yeah.
kind of security that allows you to think beyond just the next paycheck.
Absolutely. And the sources suggest this shift in mindset is having a real impact. Local businesses are expanding, people are more willing to invest in their futures. There's a tangible sense of hope and possibility in El Salvador that's directly tied to this Bitcoin revolution.
It's like they've tapped into this alternative financial system, and it's giving them a whole new perspective on what's possible.
And that brings us to what I think is the most fascinating part of all of this, the morality of money.
Ooh, okay. Getting deep here.
Well, it's true. It's not just about numbers on a screen, right? It's about what those numbers represent, the values they embody.
Okay, I like where this is going. Because I do think about that sometimes, like, am I somehow endorsing this whole system with all its flaws every time I use a dollar?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, is there even a way to opt out of these systems once you realize they're flawed? Or are we stuck?
Right. I mean, it's a question a lot of people are grappling with, and one of our sources put it so powerfully. Dollars, they argued, symbolize corruption, while Bitcoin represents something totally different, just uses. Purity, hope, brilliance even.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is, but it really makes you think about the weight of the choices we make every day, you know?
I mean, I've never really thought of using a certain currency as a moral act before, but
It's not that far-fetched, though, is it? Think about it. The source used this really interesting analogy. Imagine a farmer, right? And they're handing you this beautiful, perfect apple that they grew themselves.
okay, I'm picturing it.
And you pay them with a dollar. A dollar that's constantly losing value, that's part of a system riddled with hidden fees and inflation. It just feels inherently unfair to that farmer.
Yeah, totally. Especially knowing how much work went into growing that apple. Like, you want to make sure they're getting a fair deal, but
But that's the thing about these systems we're talking about. That unfairness, it's almost baked in. And we're all sort of complicit, you know?
okay, but if we're talking about Bitcoin as an alternative, I mean, is it really that simple? Just switch currencies and suddenly everything is fair and just?
No, I'm not saying it's a magic bullet or anything. But it does offer a different way of thinking about these transactions. Because when you pay for that apple with Bitcoin, it's like you're saying, hey, I see the value in what you've created and I want to compensate you fairly.
It's a totally different energy, right? Like almost a vote of confidence in that farmer and the work they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And those little votes, those choices we make every day about how we spend our money and who we support, they add up. Over time, they shape the entire economic landscape.
Okay, that's pretty powerful when you think about it that way. It's like
Yeah.
we actually have more power than we realize to create a system that reflects our values.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that money is more than just a means of exchange. It's a reflection of our priorities, our values, our beliefs about the kind of world we want to live in. And speaking of taking action and putting these ideas into practice, our source was really excited about this upcoming Adopting Bitcoin conference in El Salvador.
Oh yeah, I heard about that. It sounds like it's going to be huge.
Yeah, more than 1,000 Bitcoin enthusiasts, entrepreneurs, developers, all gathered in one place to learn, collaborate, and, really push this revolution forward.
And if anyone listening is intrigued by what we've been talking about today, I feel like this conference would be an amazing way to dive in even deeper.
For sure. It's not just some stuffy conference either. They've got all sorts of cool stuff planned at Bitcoin Farmers Market.
Wait, seriously? That's amazing. I wish I could go.
I know, right? Sounds like an incredible opportunity to experience this energy firsthand, to connect with people who are actually building this alternative future we keep talking about.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who's thinking about booking a ticket, we've got a special discount code just for you, Robin. Gets you a sweet deal on tickets to experience the future of finance firsthand.
And maybe stock up on some Bitcoin-friendly produce while you're there. But before we wrap up completely, we wanted to circle back to a question that came up in our last episode. Someone was wondering, how would everyday prices actually work under a Bitcoin standard?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think a lot of people are curious about that, especially with all the talk about Bitcoin's price volatility.
Right. People hear Bitcoin and they think, oh, my groceries are going to cost $1 million. But our source had this really interesting and kind of counterintuitive take on this. They said wages would likely go down under a Bitcoin standard.
Wait, really? That doesn't sound so great.
I know, right? Sounds kind of scary at first. But here's the thing. While wages might decrease, the cost of goods and services would plummet even more.
So it's less about how much money you're making and more about what that money can actually buy.
Exactly. Because if everything from rent to groceries to healthcare becomes way more affordable, then even with a smaller wage, your purchasing power would actually skyrocket.
It's like this total system reset, where efficiency and real value are actually rewarded.
Exactly. And I think that's what we keep coming back to in these deep dives. It's not just about Bitcoin, right? It's about challenging our assumptions about how these systems should work, about what's possible when we start thinking outside of these traditional boxes.
It's about realizing that a more equitable, more transparent, and ultimately more hopeful future is within reach if we're willing to embrace new ideas and, yeah, maybe even question some of the old ones.
Could have done it better myself. It's all about asking questions, staying curious, and never being afraid to explore these big ideas.
Absolutely. And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin and property rights? Hit us up on all the socials, join the conversation, and let's keep this deep dive going. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time.